So I just used arithmetic all the time for everything. And I became incredibly good at it. I mean, I could do everything in my mind, and now I never had to use a slide ruler, for example. My mind somehow works, and I can see what approximately the answer is going to be. And then my dad didn't like to do bookkeeping. So he had a business, and I had to do, from the time I was 10 years old, he knew I loved to do all this stuff, and so he just had me do all of his bookkeeping and pay all his help and keep track of his books and all that sort of stuff. So I just loved it. I just loved to use arithmetic for everything. And mathematics, eventually algebra, and then geometry and calculus, and whatever new math came along, I wanted to use it for something, and I always found some really great things to use it for.
If you don't like to do this, then find something else you like to do. Because the saddest thing in the world is there are people who sort of work for decades just, so they can be free to do something else. I always say, I'm never going to retire. I have managed to combine all of my musical hobby, my electronics hobby, my puzzle hobby, my humor, such as it is, hobby, into what I do. And I just keep doing it. And I do it whether I make money doing it or not.
Anyway, so I became an expert on the structure and function of these steroid hormones that come from the adrenals or your testes or your ovaries. I wanted to know how these hormones were made, what governed them, what caused them to become high, low, normal, abnormal. And so I began to get into genetics, and I'm very proud of the fact that I taught myself the genetics of hormone synthesis, so that I cloned the genes that were responsible for these hormones. And as a result, if I saw an abnormal hormone, I would go look for the abnormal gene, and therefore I had the cause, the mechanism, which is what I was looking for.
In some ways, I never had a choice but to be interested in science or medicine, and my own rebellion as an adolescent was an effort not to be. I grew up with parents who had met at Harvard Medical School in the 1950s. And my father taught me that I should, as a child, accept what he and my mother said. But in order to become an adult, I must take everything I had ever been taught and re-examine it and find out whether I really believed it on the basis of the right reasons or whether I was just copying my parents. In other words, he instructed me to rebel. It's the worst thing you could do to an adolescent. Because if you're instructed to rebel, how do you rebel? And since they had both gone to medical school, the very first thing I knew was I was not going to medical school. And the second thing I knew was if I did go to medical school, it would not be Harvard. And the third was if I did go to Harvard Medical School, I would not live a life in academics. As I tried on other things, and I learned a little bit about science and a little bit about math and a little bit about comparative literature or music, I found myself applying to Harvard Medical School. And before I knew it, I had an MD, I was a pediatrician, I had an interest in neuroscience, and I discovered that, yeah, actually I was a lot like my parents.
When I was a kid in grade school and middle school, I developed a passion for tropical fish, and I had dozens of aquariums in my home. Probably most people thought I was nuts. I mean, it was this kid, and you walked in his room, and I may have had 20 aquaria in the room, which was not something that was typical of, I don't know, 12-year-olds. But it was great fun, and it was a hobby that I think turned into something more than a hobby.
So I started off seeing patients with the Infectious Disease Fellows program that had just been created at this facility, and the patients that were coming back from Vietnam were a wonderful group of young men with extremely interesting, diseases, and I was lucky enough to, get the next step in the research scientist career, so that I stayed another 3 years by the end of 5 years of working primarily in research, I was sort of hooked, and loved my career at the VA, and have stayed on ever since.
I was an undergraduate at Cornell, which is where I met my husband, and I got into the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, which at that time was harder to get into than Harvard. So I called my father, and I was very proud, and said in Italian, "I've been admitted to the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine," on the phone. Silence. Then there came, "All I ever wanted you to be was a composer," and he hung up on me. But so it took some time, years, for him to become proud of me, but eventually he did.
My primary influence was the mentor that I worked with when I was a medical student at NYU Medical School. And her name was Dr. Marjorie Zucker, and she was a very, very famous platelet biologist. She taught me how to do science. She taught me about scientific integrity. She taught me about being critical. She taught me about thinking about proper controls. She taught me about how to read the scientific literature critically.